The night they put her in the ring, I was the one who signed the order. I want to start there because every man who tells a story like this tends to begin at the moment he became the hero of it. I'm not that kind of man. Or I was not then. What I was then was a king who had sat on a cold throne for 11 years and had learned to keep his chest sealed like a vault, and who looked at the culling trial the way he looked at every other administrative necessity of running the largest wolf pack in the northern range, as a thing to be gotten through before dinner. The culling trial, that is what we called it, not what it was, which was a spectacle. A piece of theater the Elder Council had been running for 2 generations, long before I inherited the crown of Veldrath. The rule was old and simple. Any unmated Omega who reached their 25th winter without a claiming, who had no pack bond, no mate mark, no wolf of their own, and no family sponsor willing to vouch for them, was brought before the Alpha King to prove their worth to the pack or be released from it. Released. That was the word the council used. Cast out was what it was. Sent into the mountain passes with a winter's worth of provisions and the pack's polite indifference at their backs. There were usually 1 or 2 per season. Most of them had something to offer, a trade, a healing gift, a bloodline the council could use. Most of them passed with very little theater. The council would ask them to demonstrate their skill, or their strength, or their knowledge of pack lore, and they would demonstrate it. And the Alpha King would grant them continued place, and everyone would go back to their business. But sometimes there was a name on the list that the council had been saving. Keeping the way a man keeps a stone in his boot, not because he means to throw it, but because he's been walking with it so long he's forgotten it's there. And when the name was called, the hall would change. The air would change. I could always feel it, the shift from administrative proceeding to entertainment. The wolves in the crowd would lean forward. The younger warriors would start placing bets. Saren of No Pack was that kind of name. She had come to Veldrath 3 winters prior, the last living member of a border pack that had been burned out by a rival territory dispute that was none of Veldrath's concern, and that I had declined to intervene in, a decision I have thought about every single day since. She had walked through the mountain gate in the first snow of that season, alone, 17 days after the burning, on feet that were bleeding through her boots, and asked for shelter in a voice that, the gate captain told me later, did not shake once. We gave it to her because we give shelter to pack survivors. It is law, and I am a man who follows law. What I did not do was think about her particularly. She went into the lower quarters, took a work placement in the pack's supply stores, did her job without complaint, and did not draw attention to herself for 3 years. That should have been a good thing. In Veldrath, not drawing attention to yourself was considered a reasonable way to live. But the pack has a long memory, and the pack had noticed things. The pack had noticed that she had no wolf, that she never shifted, not once in 3 years, not at the moon ceremonies, not during the festival runs. That she was small and quiet, and when other Omegas formed their social bonds and their laughter-filled corners of the feast hall, Saren stood apart and watched with those gray eyes of hers, not coldly, not bitterly, just watching. As if she had been watching humans for so long that she had learned to be a student of them rather than a participant. They called her the Still One. The younger wolves thought it was funny. The older warriors found it unsettling in the way that anything genuinely unreadable is unsettling to people who believe they can read everything. The Elder Council, when her name came to the culling trial list, noted simply that she had demonstrated no wolf traits in 3 years of residence, shows no evidence of a pack bond forming, and has not received nor issued any mate mark response. I read that report on a Tuesday morning, signed the trial order, and went back to reading a trade agreement from the Eastern Valleys. I did not think about Saren of No Pack again, until she walked into the trial ring on a Friday evening with the whole pack watching. The trial ring in Veldrath is not subtle architecture. It was built by my grandfather, who believed that wolves needed spectacle the way they needed food, that the ceremony of power was as important as power itself. It is a full circle of white stone, sunk 12 feet into the ground beneath the main stronghold, open to the sky through a gap in the mountain rock above that funnels whatever light or weather happens to be falling. That evening it was falling snow. Fine and early season and indifferent, the way the mountains are indifferent, the way I was trying to be indifferent when I descended the carved steps from my throne level and took my seat in the Alpha's chair at the ring's north edge. My chair is not a throne, technically. Thrones are for halls. but it is elevated enough that I look down into the ring, and it is flanked by my two senior wolves, Bran on my left, who is the size of a small shed and who has served 3 generations of Veldrath's leadership, and Isolde on my right, who is my elder council liaison and who was the one who had put Saren's name on the list. "This one will be quick," Isolde said, not lowering her voice. Around us the assembled pack was finding their seats on the stone benches that tear up from the ring floor. There were perhaps 200 wolves present. This was not unusual. The culling trials were open to the pack, and wolves liked to watch. "The still one," someone said behind me, and there was laughter. I turned to look at the ring floor. Saren was already there. She had come in from the south entrance while I was settling into my chair, and she stood at the center of the ring now with her hands loose at her sides and her eyes moving steadily around the space, cataloging it, I realized. Measuring. Not in the way a fighter measures a ring, assessing angles of attack, but in the way a person measures any new room they've been put into. Noting the exits, noting the distances. Calm. She was slight. I had known that from the file, but seeing her in the ring, where the trial ring tends to make everyone look exposed, like an insect pinned on white stone, it was starker. Brown hair pulled back, simple gray wool that was too thin for the temperature, boots that had been resoled twice. Sea gray eyes. No wolf, no mate mark on her wrists. No pack glow, which is the slight luminescence that pack-bonded wolves carry at the temples and the hands when they're among their own, a thing so automatic that most wolves don't know they have it. Saren had no glow. She stood in the ring like a human woman at a wolf court, and the court was amused. "Who stands as the trial's challenge?" I said, using my formal voice, the one that bounces off the stone walls and comes back at you. Normally the challenge was the council's appointed assessor, someone who would present the Omega with a task to demonstrate their gift. But the council had not appointed an assessor for Saren. Instead, from the north corridor, someone I knew walked in. Orent. He was the pack's third-ranked warrior. He was 28 years old, 6 feet and 4 inches of northern wolf, a man who had won 4 consecutive challenge bouts in the last 2 years, and who wore the kind of casual assurance that very large, very fast, very strong men wear when they have never once in their lives needed to be afraid. He was also, I noted with the first real flicker of something I was not yet willing to name, grinning. "The council presents a strength trial," Isolde said beside me, with a smoothness that told me she had been waiting to say it. "As no gift has been demonstrated by the claimant in 3 years of residence, the trial defaults to combat demonstration. Standard ring rules apply. First to yield or fall yields the match." The pack responded. Not loudly, wolves don't cheer at culling trials the way they cheer at festivals. But there was a ripple, a shift, 100 bodies leaning forward together in a way that is the wolf equivalent of a crowd going "oh." Because there was no version of this that Saren could win. She was an unmated Omega with no wolf, 130 pounds against a man who probably carried that much in his left shoulder alone. Oren had been chosen not because this was a genuine test, but because the result was predetermined and everyone knew it, and the only question was how fast. I did not intervene. I signed the trial order. Standard ring rules apply. I told myself this was correct. I told myself that Saren would yield quickly, take the standard 2 injuries grace provision of the code, and we would move to determination of her exile provisions. I told myself this in the particular tone I had developed over 11 years of kingship, the one that sounds very sure. Oren walked to the ring center. He was still grinning. And Saren turned to face him. What happened next I have replayed in my memory every day for 4 years. I have tried to find the word for what she did, and I have not found it yet, so I will describe it instead and let the word find itself. She did not run, she did not crouch into a fighting stance. She did not, and this was the thing that stopped the first laugh in the crowd mid-breath, she did not look afraid. She looked at Oren the way she had looked at the ring when she walked in, measuring, present, those gray eyes steady and without apology. Oren moved first. He was not cruel, I want to be precise about this because it matters. He moved the way a trained wolf moves with an untrained opponent, which is to say he moved decisively and with the clear intention of ending it fast, which in a terrible backward way was the kindest thing he could have done. His reach is enormous. He closed the distance in 2 strides and brought his right arm across in the sweeping motion that is the first of Veldrath's standard submission holds. The one designed to catch an opponent across the chest, stagger them, bring them to their knees. Saren moved. I don't mean she dodged. She was not fast enough to dodge Orin at full extension. No one who weighs 130 pounds is fast enough for that. What she did was something smaller and more impossible. She moved with it. She shifted her weight back and to the left in the last fraction of a second before contact, so that instead of catching her chest, the sweep caught her shoulder. And instead of staggering, she turned, absorbing it into a three-quarter spin that left her 2 feet to his left and still standing. The crowd went quiet. Orin blinked. He recovered quickly. He is a good warrior, and came again, this time lower, a proper tackle attempt, both arms extended. And again Saren moved, not out of the way. Into it, she dropped into a low center of gravity stance I didn't recognize and let his momentum take him past her, both his arms closing on empty air, and she stepped back and he caught himself on one knee. He rose without embarrassment and looked at her differently now. "You've trained," he said. She didn't answer, she watched him. He came again. What followed was, I have no military word for it because it wasn't military. It was not a fight. She never attempted to strike him. She never went for a hold, never reached for his arm or his shoulder, never made any offensive move at all. What she did again and again and again in ways that grew more precise as the minutes passed was simply refuse to be where he wanted her to be when he arrived. She moved like water finding its way around stone, not dramatically, not with any performance of it, just with this quiet, implacable efficiency that made Orin look, over and over, like a man swinging at weather. She took hits. I want to be clear about that, too. She was not untouchable. She was not some supernatural fighter who couldn't be reached. He caught her twice in the ribs in the first 5 minutes, and once across the jaw that snapped her head to the side. And each time she went down to one knee, and each time she came back up. She did not yield. The crowd had stopped making any sound at all. I noticed this at the 7-minute mark, which I know because I was watching the water clock on the ring's north wall with a precision that was. I understand now, my mind doing anything other than sitting with what was happening in my chest. My wolf had gone still. Not, I need to explain what I mean by that. A wolf going still is not the same as a wolf going quiet. My wolf has been quiet for years. My wolf settled into a low, banked silence after my mate Mark failed to wake at 18, and at 20, and at 25, and has lived in that silence ever since in the way a fire lives when there is not enough air present but not burning. I learned not to notice it. This was different. This was my wolf standing up in my chest. Not lunging, not howling, not doing any of the things the old stories say a wolf does when it finds its mate. Standing. The way a man stands when he hears something in a dark room and goes completely still to listen. I noticed this at the 7-minute mark and made myself stop noticing it and looked back at the ring. Orin had caught her again. She was on both knees this time, breathing hard, one hand braced against the stone floor. There was blood at the corner of her mouth. The crowd waited. She looked up at Orin. He looked back at her, and something in the line of his face had changed. He was not grinning anymore. He was looking at her the way you look at something you've misidentified. "Yield," he said, not unkindly. Saren put her hand flat on the stone and pushed herself up. Something happened in the ring in that moment that I cannot explain physically. The air did not change. The light did not change. The snow was still coming through the gap above, still indifferent, still fine. But every wolf in the tiers felt something. I know they did, because I watched 200 bodies shift at the same instant like a school of fish changing direction in water. And the only thing that had moved was Saren getting to her feet. My wolf pressed forward in my chest, as if against glass. She stood, she brought her hands back to loose at her sides. She looked at Orin. And on her left wrist, through the worn cuff of her gray wool sleeve, something lit. A mate Mark waking is not subtle. The stories make it sound like a quiet thing, a warmth, a glow, a private knowing. And perhaps for some it is. I do not know what it is like for most people because my own Mark has never woken, not fully, not in 31 years of waiting. I have felt it stir on rare occasions, twice in my life, dimly, and both times in the company of women I respected but did not know, and both times it faded within hours. What lit on Saren's wrist in the trial ring of Veldrath was not a stir. It was a blaze. She looked down at her own arm as if someone had spoken her name from inside her skin. The sleeve had ridden up slightly from the fighting, and the mark was visible now. A wolf moon design that I would later understand had been dormant on her since birth, had been there all along in the way that some wolves carry marks that never wake because the mate is not near enough, not known, not present. The design was the old Veldrath pattern. The old Veldrath pack marking that only appears on a Veldrath wolf's fated mate. The ring was completely silent. On my left wrist, which I had not thought about in 6 years, something tore open like a locked door hit with a battering ram. I looked down. My mate mark, which had given me nothing but dull, patient silence for 11 years on the throne, was burning. I have been a soldier and a king, and a man who has ruled through 3 winters of famine and a border war, and a succession crisis that required me to sit across a table from my own treacherous cousin for 17 hours without once letting him see that I knew what he'd done. I have learned to keep my face. I am told I am very good at it. I looked up from my wrist. Bran on my left was staring at my hand. Isolde on my right was staring at my hand. In the ring below, Oren had stepped back from Saren with an expression that was not a warrior's expression, but something much younger and more honest. He was staring at her wrist. And Saren was looking at the mark the way she had looked at everything in that ring, with total attention, with that stillness that was not absence but was instead the most precise kind of presence. Her breathing was still hard from the fighting, but her hands were no longer loose at her sides. Her left hand was curled against her chest with the mark visible, burning wolf silver and moon gold in the cold air of the ring. Then she raised her eyes. She looked up from the ring floor past Oren, past the stunned first tier of the crowd, up through the tiers of standing, staring wolves, and found me. How she knew where I was, I cannot tell you. I was not in an obvious position. I was in the Alpha's chair at the north edge, elevated but not dramatically so, and she had not looked at me once in the entire trial as far as I had noticed. But she found me in under 2 seconds, which is less time than it takes to scan a crowd, which means she did not scan. She simply looked up, and I was where she was looking. My mark burned so hard it was close to pain. I stood up. I have been asked since that night by Bran and by Isolde and by my younger sister Ayla, who has made it something of a personal mission to understand what happened, what I was thinking when I stood up, what the thought was. They want a thought. A consideration, a calculation, the kind of rational process that leads to a decision. There was no thought. My wolf was not pressed against glass anymore. My wolf was walking, and so I walked. The steps from the Alpha's chair to the ring floor are 14. I know because I have taken them thousands of times, for ceremonies, for declarations, for executions of pack law that I will not enumerate here. I have never taken them fast. Speed signals panic, and a king does not panic. I did not run. But I took them at a pace that Bran described to me later as the fastest walking I have ever seen a man do while remaining technically walking, and I will accept that description. The crowd parted, not because I told them to, because I said nothing, but because 200 wolves felt what was coming down those steps and moved before I reached them. I walked through the parting like it was the only natural thing, because it was, because there was only one direction I was capable of moving, and it was toward the woman standing in the center of my ring with her blood on the stone and my mark burning on her wrist. Oren saw me coming and stepped aside. He moved with a speed that was not subordination, exactly. It was more honest than that. He moved the way you move when you realize you've been standing between 2 things that are meant to find each other, and you understand that what you are is an obstacle. I stepped into the ring. I stopped 6 feet from Saren. This is the part that I think about most of all the parts, the 6 feet. Because she was standing still, she hadn't moved when I descended, hadn't stepped back, hadn't folded into any of the submissive postures that an Omega would typically adopt when an Alpha King walks into their space. She stood the way she had stood through the entire fight, hands loose, weight even, sea gray eyes present and direct. She was still bleeding from the corner of her mouth. There was a bruise forming along her left cheekbone that was going to be spectacular by morning. Her hands showed the marks of the stone floor where she'd braced them. She looked at me the way she had looked at everything, as if I were information, as if she were simply taking in what I was and deciding what it meant. "You're hurt," I said. This is what I said first. Not your name or the formal declaration or any of the words I had been trained since boyhood to say in moments of pack significance. I said, "You're hurt," like an idiot. like a man who has had every courtly formality scoured out of him by the proximity of the only thing that has ever knocked his wolf sideways. Something changed in her face. It was small, the particular kind of small that tells you it cost something to let it happen. Her chin didn't move, her eyes didn't fill, but something behind them shifted like a room changing temperature, and she said, "I've been hurt before." 3 words. 11 years of exile and survival, and a pack burned to ash, and 3 winters in someone else's stronghold catalogued in 3 words. Not for effect, not for pity, just as fact. I've been hurt before. It is the most compact biography I have ever heard. My mark burned. "I know," I said, though I didn't not yet. "I know." I looked at her wrist. She was still holding it curled against her chest, not hiding it. She was past hiding at this point. But as if she wasn't sure yet what to do with something that had just woken up uninvited in her body and announced itself to a mountain kingdom. I looked at my own left hand. 2 marks, the same design. The old Veldrath wolf moon pattern. And if I had needed any further education in what I was looking at, the fact that the design was identical would have provided it. "Saren of no pack," I said, and my voice came out in the register I didn't use for administrative proceedings or formal declarations. It came out the way Bran tells me my father's voice sounded when my father spoke to my mother, low and certain, and with all the armor off. She looked at me. "You are Saren of Veldrath," I said, "if you'll have it." The crowd above us was making no sound at all. 200 wolves, and the only thing in the ring was the snow coming down, fine and indifferent, landing on the white stone and the blood on the stone and the 2 marks burning in the cold air. Saren looked at me for a long moment. "Your wolf refused to watch," she said. I understood what she meant. She had felt it. The moment my wolf had stood up in my chest and pressed forward, she had felt it through the bond like a pressure, and she had understood what it was even if she hadn't understood why, and she was telling me she knew. "He couldn't," I said. She looked down at her wrist, then up at me. "I've never had a pack," she said. "I don't know what I'm supposed to do." "Neither do I," said, which was perhaps the most honest thing I had ever said out loud to another person in 31 years. And she looked at me when I said it with an expression that I have since learned is what Saren looks like when she believes something, when it lands in her as true, and which is one of the few things on this earth that reliably undoes me. I took off my cloak. The cloak of the Alpha King of Veldrath is black wolf pelt over charcoal gray wool, lined with the silver of the old pack's ceremonial color, and it is large enough that when I put it over Saren's shoulders in that ring it swallowed her. It reached the floor. The hood fell over her face and she had to push it back. The crowd made a sound. It wasn't the roar you hear at festivals. It wasn't approval exactly. It was something older, a sound wolves make when something long suspended resolves, when a tension that has been living in the pack's collective body is released all at once. A wolf pack breathe. And then from somewhere in the second tier, someone bowed. I didn't see who it was, I was looking at Saren. But I heard the shift of weight, the rustle of movement, and when I looked up the second tier was bowing, and then the third, and then the first tier, and then Orin, who was still standing in the ring, bowed with a formality that I had never seen from him in 4 years of his service, and that told me he understood exactly what he had been part of that night. Isolde on the steps bowed. Bran bowed, and Bran has bowed to 3 generations of Veldrath's leadership, and is not given to the gesture freely. Saren stood under my cloak with the blood still at the corner of her mouth, and the mate mark still burning on her wrist, and her chin at the exact same angle it had been at when she walked into this ring, which is to say, level. She looked around at the bowing pack. She looked at me. "Did you know," she said, "before tonight?" "No," I said. "Did any of them?" I thought about Isolde, who had put her name on the list. I thought about the particular precision of a strength trial with Orin as the challenge, when there were 20 other assessment options the council could have chosen. I thought about what a woman who had spent 3 years in a pack watching everyone closely might have noticed that I, on my throne, had not. "I don't think they knew what they knew," I said. She considered this. "That's not better." "No," I said, "it isn't." She looked at the mark on her wrist. The burning was settling now, not fading, but deepening, the way a fire does when it stops being startled and becomes what it is. She turned her arms slightly so the light from above caught it, and she studied the design the way she studied everything. It was there when I was born, she said. My mother told me. She said it was the mark of a mate who hadn't found me yet and that I should be patient. A pause. She didn't say anything about a trial ring. I'm sorry about the trial ring, I said. Are you sorry about the order you signed? There it was, straight and without theater, the way she did everything. Yes, I said, I am. She looked at me steadily. Good, she said. And then, because she was Saren, she said nothing further about it. She did not press it, did not make me stand in it any longer than the moment required. She accepted the acknowledgement and set it down, and that single act told me more about who she was than anything I had read in a file or watched in a ring. I offered her my arm. She looked at it, she looked at my face. Then she put her hand in the crook of my elbow, not clutching, just resting, the way someone rests their hand on something they've decided to trust. And we walked together out of the trial ring while the pack of Veldrath stood and watched, and did not make a sound until we had gone. The weeks that followed were not simple. I want to be honest about that because the stories tend to cut from the moment of claiming to some seamless after where the mate bond has done all the work of knowing and trust and history, and two people who were strangers are suddenly fluent in each other. That is not how it works. The bond is a certainty, not a biography. It tells you this one, not everything about this one, and the rest, the learning, the sitting across from someone at dinner, and discovering that she finds your council meetings tedious but has very specific opinions about northern trade routes. The finding out that she wakes before dawn and reads by a single candle and will not speak before the second cup of tea. The learning what she lost when her pack burned and how she carries it, not as weight exactly but as landscape. As permanent terrain she moves through rather than around. All of that is the work of time, which the bond does not give you. What the bond gives you is the certainty that the work is worth it, which is, I have since decided, quite enough. She moved into the Alpha's quarters at the end of the first week, though moved in is perhaps too settled a phrase for what was initially a negotiation. Saren had opinions about space. Not about its size. She had lived in a single room in the lower quarters for 3 years and had arranged it into something precise and functional and entirely her own, but about what she did with it. She brought very little with her, a worn book of northern botany that had been her mother's. A small carved wolf her father had made, which she placed on the window ledge of her new rooms on the first morning. A handful of letters she'd never sent to people she'd lost, which I know about because she told me, not because I looked. She did not ask for much from me in that first week. She asked for access to the library, which I granted immediately. She asked whether she was expected to attend the morning court, and I said no, and she said good, because mornings before the second cup of tea were not a time for courts. She asked on the third day whether the wolves who had watched the trial had understood what they were watching, and I said honestly that I thought some of them had felt what the bond was before they could name it, and she nodded slowly and said she thought so too, because she had felt the whole room change before the mark lit, which was interesting, she thought. She was always doing that, finding something interesting where another person would find it overwhelming. It was not detachment. I want to be very clear about that. It was not the detachment of someone who has stopped feeling things. It was something more like the particular attention of a person who learned early to observe rather than react, and who has survived long enough on that practice that it has become the most natural thing in her. I asked her about it once, where she had learned to stand still in a ring. She was quiet for a moment, the way she goes quiet when she's deciding whether a question deserves its real answer. My Pax Beta taught me, she said. After the third winter, he said I was too small to fight through anything, so I'd need to learn to move around it. She paused. He died in the burning. What was his name? Davin. Tell me about him, I said. And she did. And that was the first hour of the many hours we spent sitting in the window of the Alpha's quarters with the mountain spread out below us, where she told me about the world she'd lost, and I told her about the world I'd built, and we found, slowly, the common ground between them, which turned out to be larger than either of us had estimated, which is, I think, usually how it goes with people who have spent a long time standing alone. The formal claiming ceremony was at the new moon, 3 weeks after the trial. The ceremony is not the event in Veldrath. The event was the ring, and everyone knew it. The ceremony is the public record, the pack assembled in the great hall, the Alpha King and his mate standing at the stone dais at the hall's center, the oath spoken before the pack's eldest wolf, The exchange of the formal marks that layer over the faded marks like a translation of the same word into the pack's own language. Saren wore the pale gray that is Veldrath's ceremony color for a mate's claiming, and she wore it the way she wore everything, simply, without ceremony about the ceremony. Her hair was down. The mate mark on her wrist was visible, permanent now, no longer burning but settled into its design with the solidity of something that has always been true and is only now being read correctly. She was calm. She is always calm, my Saren. But there is a difference I've learned between her stillness when she is managing something and her stillness when she is simply at ease. And in the hall that night, in front of 200 wolves who had watched her stand in a ring and refuse to fall, she was simply at ease. As if she had considered the room, as she considers every room, and found that there was nothing in it that required managing. Isolde spoke the ceremony. She had come to me, 4 days after the trial, with an expression I had not seen on her face before, something between contrition and the particular dignity of a person who has made a mistake they intend to own without theater. She said she had put Saren's name on the list because she had seen something she hadn't had a name for, and she had wanted to see it named. I told her what she had done was dangerous, and she told me she knew, and I told her she was still my council liaison, and she said she knew that too, and we didn't speak of it again, which is Veldrath's way of resolution between people who respect each other. The pack was assembled, and Isolde spoke the words, and I took Saren's hand and said what I said, and she said what she said, and my wolf, who had been standing in my chest since the night in the ring, not pressed against glass anymore, just standing and breathing in the specific way a wolf breathes when it has found what it was looking for, made a sound that I felt through my whole body, low and certain, not a howl but something below howling. A settling. The pack responded. Pack wolves respond to an alpha's bond settling the way they respond to the moon. They don't choose to, they simply do. 200 wolves took a breath at the same moment, and when they let it out the hall was different. Warmer. The way any room becomes warmer when something that was held is released. Saren looked at me. She was still holding my hand, and she looked at me with those gray eyes that had looked at me across a ring with blood at the corner of her mouth, and seen something she decided to trust, and she said, quietly enough that only I could hear, "Your wolf is loud." "I know," I said. "I'm sorry." "Don't be," she said. And then, almost to herself, "It's the first time anything has been loud for a long time. There is something I have to say about the pack, and I will say it plainly. The wolves who had laughed in the tears when Saren's name was called, they were not bad people. I want to resist the satisfaction of making them simple villains, because they were not. They were wolves doing what wolves do when they are not watching themselves, which is follow the tone of the room, and the tone of the room that night had been set long before Saren walked in, set by the council's framing of the trial as a foregone conclusion, set by 3 years of the still one, and the casual small cruelties that accumulate around a person when the pack has decided without deciding that they are outside the circle. What changed that night was not that those wolves became different people. What changed was that they saw Saren, not the still one, not the refugee with no wolf, not the name on a list, but Saren. They saw what she did in that ring and they were changed by it, not because the bond showed them to be, but because some things, witnessed honestly, are sufficient to change a person. I do not mean they all became her friends. Belonging is built slowly out of small repeated acts, and Saren took her time with it and they took their time with it, and it was not a transformation that happened at a ceremony. But it happened. Orin came to me 2 days after the trial and asked to be assigned to the Luna's honor guard when the position was formally created. I told him to ask her himself. He went very still in the particular way very large men go still when they are nervous, and then he went and asked her, and she looked at him for a long moment and said, "You hit hard." And he said, "Not hard enough, apparently." And she said, "No, you didn't." And she accepted. He served her for 4 years and is still her most reliable guard. And she calls him Orin, and he calls her my Luna in a tone that is not formality, and is something much closer to whatever respect looks like when it's been earned in a ring at close range. The Elder Council was restructured. This is the administrative fact. The culling trial as a practice was ended. I ended it in the 3rd week after the ring, with a formal decree that Bran helped me draft, and that was, I think, the most carefully worded decree I have ever issued, because it needed to do 2 things at once. Close a door that should have been closed generations ago, and do so without the particular smugness that would have made it harder for the council to receive with grace. Isolde received it with grace. Several other council members did not, and some of them are no longer council members, and that is the most I will say about that. The lower quarters of Veldrath were expanded and properly funded the following spring. This was Saren's doing, presented to me on a Tuesday morning while I was reading a trade agreement, which I found fittingly symmetrical. She had spent 3 weeks talking with the people who still lived there, talking, not consulting, which is a different thing. And she brought me a proposal written in the precise, clear handwriting that she uses for things she wants to be taken seriously, and told me that it would cost rather a lot and would require restructuring 2 budget lines that the council had considered settled. I signed it without argument, which I am told was unprecedented, and which I tell you now was not a coincidence. It is 4 years on from that Friday evening, and I am telling this in the study of the Alpha's quarters at the north end of Veldrath's stronghold, at the window that looks out at the mountain, which is doing what it does in early winter, putting snow on everything with a thoroughness that feels almost editorial. Saren is across the room. She is at her reading table with her Northern Botany book and her second cup of tea, which is a ritual that I have learned is as foundational to her mornings as breathing and considerably more protected. She has her feet up on the low stool she had moved from another room on the second day of her arrival, and has kept there since, and she is completely absorbed in whatever she is reading, and she has not noticed yet that I am watching her instead of reviewing the trade correspondence on my desk. She is not loud. She will never be loud. She does not fill a room with noise or gesture or the particular insistent energy that some people use to make themselves known. She makes herself known the way still water makes itself known, which is by being present and by being, eventually, looked into. I look at her, and I think about the 14 steps from the Alpha's chair to the ring floor. I think about the snow coming down, fine and indifferent, and how it was not indifferent to me at all. Not in that moment, not with my mark burning and my wolf walking forward and Saren looking up through the crowd and finding me in under 2 seconds. I think about what I said to her, "You're hurt." She forgave me for that sentence by responding with "I've been hurt before," which is the sort of answer that forecloses the need for forgiveness by being simply the truth. She is like that. She will not let you languish in a guilt that she doesn't need from you, and she will not pretend that the thing didn't happen, and the combination of those 2 things is, I have found, very close to what mercy looks like in practice. My mate mark is visible at my wrist now in all seasons. I do not wear the long council cuffs anymore. Bran noted this after the first month and said nothing, which is how Bran says everything important. Saren noticed me notice that he'd noticed, and she said he likes it. And I said, "How can you tell?" And she said, "I've been watching your pack for 3 years, Kaelan. I know what they look like when they like something." And she was right. She usually is. It is one of the few things I am regularly wrong about. I underestimate her repeatedly, and she corrects me without comment. This morning, before she settled with the tea and the botany book, she told me that the lower quarters expansion project has a naming question that needs resolution. Apparently, the Pax builders have been calling the central common space, the Queen's Hall, in the informal way that building sites develop names before the official dedication, and several of the residents have taken it up, and she was asking whether I had an opinion. I told her that the Queen's Hall was not accurate since she was not a queen, she was a Luna, and there was a difference in Veldrath's governance structure. She looked at me over her tea. "They know that," she said. "They're calling it that because they want to." I thought about this. "Then call it what they want to call it," I said. She put her tea down, picked up the botany book, and said without looking up, "That's what I was going to do anyway." This is also how she usually does things. My wolf is not loud in the way she meant it that night in the hall, not to me, not most of the time. He has settled into something that is less like a fire and more like a hearthstone, the kind of warmth that doesn't call attention to itself, that is simply there and is simply warm, and that you notice most clearly on the days when you move away from it and the cold comes back. But there are mornings, this kind of morning, winter first and quiet, with the mountain doing its editorial work outside and Saren absorbed in her reading, and the tea going cold, because she forgets it when she's reading, which she does every time, without fail, and which I note and say nothing about. There are mornings when my wolf does something that is not loud, but is something better than loud. He pays attention. He sits in my chest, and he pays attention to the woman across the room with the same precision she turns on everything she looks at, the same quality of total presence, and he does not howl or lunge or press against anything. He simply watches, the way she watches, and something in that recognition, the wolf in me watching the way she watches, both of us still, both of us present, both of us paying attention to this one life being lived in this one room on this one winter morning. Something in that is so complete that I have not found the edge of it in 4 years of looking. I don't think I will. She reaches for the tea without looking up from the page. It has gone cold, and she takes a sip and makes a very small sound of displeasure, which I know is directed at the tea and not at me, but which I take personally in the specific way. I take every small thing that inconveniences her. It's cold, I say. She looks up. You could have told me earlier. I was watching you. She considers this. The particular considering look, the one that tells me she has taken the information in and is deciding what weight to give it. That's not a defense, she says. No, I say, it isn't. She looks at me for a moment with the sea-gray eyes that have been looking at me honestly since a ring in a mountain stronghold, where the snow came down indifferent, and the pack held its breath, and my wolf refused to look away. Then she goes back to her book, and I go back to watching her. And the mountain does what it always does, outside the window, which is exactly what it needs to do and not one thing more.